Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep into a story from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15, the story of the Canaanite woman.
A fascinating story.
It really is, and it's especially meaningful in the Malankara Orthodox Church, particularly during Lent.
Oh, absolutely.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with the Malankara Orthodox tradition, it's a really ancient branch of Christianity with roots in the Middle East.
Right.
And they have this incredibly rich history of interpreting and finding new meaning in these biblical stories. And this particular story is often connected with the fourth Sunday of Great Lent in their tradition.
That's right. This story really highlights God's expansive mercy and how faith can, bridge divides. Because it features a Gentile woman, in other words, someone who isn't Jewish.
Right.
And she comes to Jesus with this really desperate plea.
Yeah, and it's interesting how she handles this encounter. Her
Yeah.
daughter is suffering, and she's bold enough to actually go to Jesus for help. But she's met with what seems like silence, even resistance at first. And that kind of makes me wonder about the power dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
You have this woman who's considered an outsider religiously and culturally.
Right.
And she's daring to challenge this figure like Jesus.
It's a really, I guess you could say, subversive moment. And some scholars think that might even be intentional on Jesus's part,
Really?
He might be using a common cultural understanding to kind of test her faith.
Oh, interesting.
And get her to really articulate her need and her belief. Right.
Okay.
Remember, in that time period, there was this rigid separation between Jews and Gentiles.
Yeah, for sure.
And this woman is stepping outside of those boundaries, demanding to be heard.
And she's persistent. She doesn't back down.
She really doesn't.
Even when Jesus uses that analogy about children and dogs.
Yeah,
Which honestly sounds kind of harsh to our modern ears.
definitely.
But she uses that analogy to her advantage
She does.
to make a point about how abundant God's mercy truly is.
Right. She says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And that statement, wow, it's remarkable on so many levels.
It really is.
It shows her incredible humility,
Yeah.
acknowledging she's an outsider, but she's also expressing this unwavering faith.
Yeah.
It's like she's arguing that even a tiny portion of God's grace would be enough to heal her daughter.
Right. Almost redefining what abundance even means. She isn't asking for the whole loaf, just a crumb.
A crumb.
But she's so convinced that even that tiny piece is powerful because of where it comes from, God's grace.
Exactly. And this connects back to that Malankara Orthodox emphasis on receiving God's mercy with humility.
Yeah.
They actually have this special Seder prayer specifically for this Sunday.
Oh, wow.
And it says, O Christ, who rewarded the faith of the Canaanite woman, grant us the same humility and persistence that we may receive the crumbs of your mercy.
So they're making this direct connection between what she does and how we should approach our faith, especially during Lent.
Exactly. They see her story as this model for how we should come to God with deep faith, unwavering persistence, and profound humility.
Okay.
Recognizing that even the smallest gift from God is precious.
I want to unpack that idea of humility a bit more because I feel like it's often misunderstood.
Oh, yeah.
Like people think it means being passive or self-deprecating. But here, her humility isn't about putting herself down.
No,
right?
no, not at all.
It's about recognizing her deep need for God's grace and boldly asking for it.
You got it. It's about understanding that we don't have it all figured out. We need something beyond ourselves, And when we acknowledge that, when we admit our limitations, it empowers us to ask for help,
Right.
to reach for those crumbs of grace.
So it's not just about passively receiving grace, it's about actively seeking it out.
Yes, exactly.
Even, demanding it in a sense.
Well, that's where persistence comes in, right?
Yeah.
This woman isn't afraid to push, to make her case.
She's not letting a little silence or even what looks like rejection stop her.
Nope.
It's like she's saying, I'm not leaving until my daughter gets what she needs.
That's a good lesson for all of us, actually.
It really is.
It's so easy to give up when we don't see answers right away.
Yeah.
But she reminds us to keep knocking, keep asking, keep seeking.
Because the story isn't just about her persistence, it's about Jesus responding to it.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that God sees our struggles, he hears us, and he is moved by our faith.
And that brings us back to that power dynamic thing you mentioned earlier.
Oh, right.
This woman, seemingly powerless, shifts the whole encounter.
Yeah.
She challenges Jesus, and he doesn't dismiss her.
Huh.
He engages with her, tests her, and then ultimately rewards her faith.
And early Syriac Christian writers like St. Ephrem the Syrian, they saw this as foreshadowing Gentiles being included in God's plan.
Oh, yeah. They understood that God's love and mercy weren't limited to just one group of people.
Right.
It extends to everyone who comes to him with real faith.
I'm curious, did St. Ephrem actually say anything specific about this story? Do we have any writings?
We do. In his Hymns on Faith, he writes, "The Canaanite woman, though a stranger, received the bread of life. Let us, who are called children, not be found unworthy of his grace."
Wow, so it's not about ethnicity or being born into the right family. It's about what's in your heart.
Exactly.
This woman, the outsider, gets this incredible gift, the bread of life, because of her faith.
Powerful, isn't it?
It really is almost like a challenge to those who think they're already in.
Mm.
Don't take God's grace for granted.
And it also subtly hints at the Eucharist, Holy Communion,
Oh, I see.
suggesting that through faith and humility, anyone can share in God's life, no matter their background or past mistakes.
That's a really rich layer, especially since this story is often highlighted during Lent.
It is.
It's like this invitation to really think about our own relationship with God, our need for grace, and if we're willing to approach him with that same kind of faith and persistence that she shows.
Exactly. Lent is a time for looking inward, for stripping away distractions and focusing on what truly matters, our connection to God.
Yeah.
And her story is this powerful guide for how we can go deeper in that connection.
You know, listening to you talk about this, it makes me think about those times I've felt like an outsider, like I didn't belong.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the moments when this story really hits home, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
We all have those Canaanite woman experiences in our lives, those times we struggle with doubt or fear, or even feeling like we're not worthy, you know?
It's true. We all have moments where we're vulnerable.
Yeah.
Times when we question if we deserve God's love.
And that's what's so powerful about her story, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like she's saying, look, even if you feel like you're on the fringes, even if you're filled with doubts,
Right.
you can still go to God. You can still ask for what you need. You can still experience his grace.
Her story is like a guide for how to get through those tough parts of faith.
Yeah.
She's not pretending to have it all figured out.
Right.
She admits her need, she keeps asking, and she trusts God's mercy, even when it doesn't look how she expected.
And you mentioning trust makes me think about something that often trips people up in this story, that dogs analogy.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about it a bit, but I think we need to dig a little deeper there.
Okay.
I mean, how do we make sense of that language, which seems harsh, with this message of God's love for everyone?
Yeah, it's tough, and it's important to be sensitive.
Yeah.
But we got to remember that Jesus was talking in a very specific cultural setting.
Right, right.
Back then, there was this huge gap between Jews and Gentiles.
Okay.
And they used language that just wouldn't fly today.
So are we supposed to just brush it off as like a cultural thing?
Well, not exactly brush it off, more like understand the historical context.
Okay.
And then see what deeper truth it might be pointing to.
I see.
Some scholars think Jesus was using this strong language on purpose, like to test her faith,
Oh, interesting.
to push her to say what she believed even more clearly.
So he's giving her a chance to show how deep her faith is, how much she understands God's mercy.
Exactly. And she doesn't disappoint. You know,
Yeah.
instead of getting offended, she steps up.
And what she says is amazing.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She's acknowledging the social order, but also kind of turning it upside down.
Ah.
Like she's saying, okay, I get what you're saying, but even if I'm like a dog in this situation,
Yeah.
even if I'm the outsider, I still believe your mercy is so big, so overflowing, that even the scraps are enough for healing.
It's a powerful reminder that God's grace can reach even the edges. That even people who feel left out or unworthy can experience his power to change them.
And that's what Jesus affirms when he gives her what she asks for.
Yeah.
He praises her for her great faith.
He sees her persistence, her humility, her unwavering belief.
And at that moment, everything shifts.
Huh.
She, the one on the margins, becomes a model of faith for everyone who hears this story.
And it's really interesting that this story often comes up during Lent.
It is.
Because Lent is all about confronting our own need for God's grace.
Yeah.
Right? It's like her journey is a reflection of our own spiritual journeys.
Lent is about letting go of pretense,
Okay.
admitting where we're broken, and turning to God with humility and repentance.
Right.
And the Canaanite woman, she embodies all of that perfectly. She's not afraid to say she needs help, to ask boldly, and to trust God, even when it doesn't look how she might want.
It's like a message saying, don't worry about proving you're good enough. Just come as you are,
Right.
with your doubts, your struggles, your messiness.
Yes.
And let God's love do its work in you.
It makes me think about another piece of this story we haven't really touched on.
What's that?
The idea of unanswered prayers.
Oh, right.
At first, she gets silence, even what seems like rejection from Jesus.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have been there, right?
Yeah.
We've all had times when our prayers feel like they're going nowhere.
When you're crying out to God, but nothing seems to be happening,
It can be so discouraging.
especially when you're dealing with pain or suffering.
Absolutely.
But maybe there's something we can learn from how the Canaanite woman deals with those silent moments.
I think there is. She doesn't quit.
Yeah.
She doesn't let the silence shut her down.
Mhm.
She keeps pushing, keeps asking, keeps believing.
And I think that's so important for all of us.
It is.
It's not about nagging God until we get what we want.
No.
It's about getting our hearts in line with what he wants, about surrendering to his wisdom,
Yeah.
and trusting that even when it's quiet, he's working things out for us.
Trusting even in the silence.
It's about holding on to that tiny bit of hope,
Yeah.
that little seed of faith, even when we don't see God doing something right away.
And that brings us back to that Sidro prayer.
Oh, right.
The one about imitating her humility and persistence.
Yeah.
Trusting that God will reward us with those crumbs of mercy.
It reminds us that even when we feel lost, confused, or even like God's forgotten us,
Right.
we can still choose to rely on his grace.
We can keep knocking, keep asking, and trust that he'll answer in his own time, in his own way.
So it's about giving up control and embracing the mystery of God's grace.
Exactly. Sometimes the answer comes differently than we expect, or maybe not when we want it.
But if we hold on to faith, if we keep praying
Yes.
and stay open to how he's leading us, we might be surprised by how he chooses to work in our lives.
And that's the amazing thing about this story.
What do you mean?
It's not just about her daughter being healed.
Okay.
It's about how powerful faith is.
Right.
How boundless God's mercy is.
Yeah.
And the surprising ways he shows his love and grace.
And sometimes the biggest miracles aren't these huge, flashy events.
Right.
They happen in those quiet moments when we surrender, in those persistent whispers of faith,
Yeah.
and in humbly accepting even the tiniest pieces of God's grace.
It's in those small, almost unnoticeable moments, those crumbs of grace, that we often encounter the deepest changes.
You know, it strikes me, we often get caught up in the dramatic parts of miracles.
Right.
Like parting the sea, healing the blind.
The big stuff.
Yeah, but sometimes the most profound change happens in these smaller moments.
Yeah.
Those almost insignificant encounters where God's grace just touches our lives in ways we don't expect.
It's true. We might be so focused on that big ask, that dramatic thing we want God to do, that we miss how he's already working in our lives.
Right.
Offering those little crumbs of grace that can actually lead to real change.
It reminds me of this time I was going through something really tough.
Oh, yeah.
And I was praying for a very specific thing to happen.
Okay.
And when it didn't, I was so disappointed, even angry.
I understand that.
It was like, God, where are you? Why aren't you answering?
I think a lot of us have felt that way.
Yeah, that feeling of being abandoned when our prayers seem to go nowhere.
Absolutely.
But looking back, I realize, even though my prayer wasn't answered the way I wanted, God was still there in those hard times.
How so?
He was working through friends who were there for me.
Yeah?
Through opportunities that kind of popped up out of nowhere. Just little acts of kindness that brought some hope back.
Right.
They weren't the big answers I was hoping for, but they were those crumbs.
Those crumbs of grace.
Yeah, they kept me going and actually led me to a different path.
A different path.
Maybe even a better one, you know?
It's a good example of how God often works in ways we just don't see coming.
It's true.
We can get so fixated on one outcome, but he sees the whole picture.
Yeah.
That bigger tapestry of our lives.
Right.
And he's weaving it all together in ways we can't always understand.
Like he's saying, trust me, I'm taking care of things. Even if it doesn't look how you pictured it, I'm working for your good, even in the mess.
And that takes letting go of control.
Yeah.
Being willing to give up how we think things should be.
And trust that God's plan is ultimately the best for us, even if there are some detours.
So it's not about demanding certain things from God.
Right.
It's about being open to those crumbs, however they show up.
Being receptive, yeah.
Right. And that's such a great invitation, especially now during Lent.
It is a time to simplify.
Yeah.
Let go of distractions.
Right.
And focus on what really matters. Our relationship with God and needing his grace.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this story, what's one big thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I think it's that God's mercy is endless, and his love can change us. Like the Canaanite woman, we can come to him with bold faith and humility,
Right.
trusting that he'll take care of our needs in ways we might never imagine.
And even if we feel like outsiders, even if we doubt ourselves, even if it feels like God's not listening,
Right.
we can hold on to that belief that he sees us, hears us, and is working for our good.
It's not about being perfect or having all the answers.
It's about knowing we need God's grace, asking boldly for what we need, and trusting that he'll meet us in those vulnerable moments,
Right.
offering those crumbs of grace that can sustain us, guide us, and ultimately lead us to a deeper experience of his love.
That's beautifully said.
It's a story that speaks to something deep in all of us.
Uh-huh.
That longing to belong, to be healed, to experience the power of God's love, to change us.
And it's a message of hope.
Yes.
No matter where we are in our faith journey, no matter how lost or unworthy we might feel, God's grace is always there, waiting for us to receive it with open hearts and expectant faith.
Beautifully put. As we journey through Lent, may we all be inspired by her example,
Yes.
seeking those crumbs of grace with bold faith, persistent prayer, and humble hearts.
Trusting that even the smallest taste of God's love can work miracles in our lives.